Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for this first session of the Health Equity Capacity Building Series. My name is Margaret Shield, and I'm the coalition organizer for Washington Breeze, and I use she, her pronouns. We appreciate each of you being here. Please introduce yourselves to the group by sharing your name and organization in the Zoom chat. Washington Breeze is a statewide coalition working to reduce the harmful impacts of commercial tobacco use, sales, and industry tactics. We work on policy systems and environmental changes to eliminate disparities and improve community health. For the next year, we are excited to be partnering with the Center for Black Health and Equity on this series to learn together, to grow and diversify the participation in our coalition, and to create our action plan to work together to end the sale of menthol and other flavored commercial tobacco products in our state. So we are very grateful today to have two excellent presenters, Ashley Hebert from the Center for Black Health and Equity and Heather Medicine Bear from the National Native Network. Before Ashley begins her presentation, Heather will provide a land acknowledgement. Thank you, Heather.
Hi, everyone. The Center for Black Health and Equity and the National Native Network acknowledge the tribes and the people who have lived on this continent from time immemorial. Currently, there are 42 tribes, 35 of which are federally recognized, that share the tribal homelands and waterways in what is now known as Washington State. We express our profound respect towards the original and current caretakers of this land and acknowledge their right to live and thrive within their homelands. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Heather. Margaret, are you ready for me?
Ashley, yes. Thank you.
Thank you. So this presentation will delve into systemic racism, which will provide context to what are the cumulative effects of racism over centuries. What is the playing field today that we are operating on, and how it shows up in our lives, wealth, and health. At the end of this presentation, you will understand the impact slavery has had on African Americans. You will understand the impact of tobacco on African Americans and Native Americans. And you will understand the role that tobacco has had in shaping America. This is very important given the climate that we are all in and the work that we are all embarking upon. We're going to talk about slavery, Jim Crow, and tobacco's impact in modern day. We can't talk about big tobacco without telling the story of colonization, race, sharecropping, capitalism, monopolies. Big tobacco is America's first great enterprise. And after colonizers stole tobacco from indigenous people, just as they stole their land, the crop became an early justification for slavery. It is a complicated history, but it is also our shared history that paints the portrait of who we are as Americans. Next slide. So just a quick intro to the Center for Black Health and Equity. Each year, approximately 45,000 African Americans die from preventable smoking-related disease. Since June 2000, the center, originally founded as the National African American Tobacco Prevention Network, has been working to reverse that burden. Next slide. So the center is one of 8 CDC-funded national networks that strategically partners with community-based organizations and groups. As you can see, those are all my siblings there with the National Native Network, and we're very excited to be co-presenting with Heather Medicine Bear today. Next slide. So the center's work has expanded. We were clearly focused on tobacco and still are, but we also address those other core influencers on African American health, including economic, institutional, and social justice. All of those other social determinants of health, we are starting to have a space in. Next slide. How do we build this capacity? We develop from scratch or identify existing coalitions like Washington Breeds to build capacity via a series of trainings, just like the one you're receiving today, to help equip communities with advocacy skills, building their capacity. Next slide. So we expand upon the community development model. We utilize a 5-part series outlined in the Health Justice Guide. And I know that Margaret did share this beautiful resource with you all. It's the Health Justice Guide that's been produced by the center. It is just a wealth of information. I have mine printed and bounded, but you have the digital version as well. Next slide. So how do we know if we built capacity? We're not just going to do trainings and that's just going to be it. You're going to have a completion of products within a roadmap. Each step of the process connects the community capacity development trainings to deliverables. You will be able to narrate your roadmap to different stakeholders, increase engagement with local communities, expanding Washington Breeds from, one community to all 4 corners of the state. An internal assessment by the center. We do a determinants of readiness tool. We have that. We can go through that in a future training. And we help you present to decision makers. Next slide. This is a visual representation of your roadmap. At the top there, it would say Washington Breeds, and you kind of go through setting your goals, setting these objectives, doing asset mapping, and it will be interactive for the coalition to be able to use. Next slide. So I'm gonna pause just quickly. Any questions, comments before we go forward? Okay, here we go. So tobacco is a plant for thousands of years used in a way to promote physical, spiritual, emotional, and community well-being in indigenous communities. It is part of the nightshade family like peppers and tomatoes. Tobacco was grown in South America as far back as 6000 BC. How did a plant that was considered sacred to Native American brothers and sisters and used for spiritual purposes end up being used to enslave tens of millions of people and create and sustain an industry that is responsible for almost 500,000 deaths per year? Next slide. The belief is that in the late 15th century, Christopher Columbus was given tobacco as a gift. It was taken back to Spain, where it gained instant popularity for its supposed magical healing powers. Let's set some of those conditions for what was happening in Europe and the colonies and how this all got started. And it really got started by peer pressure. Sometime during the 1580s, Sir Walter Raleigh, one of the most famous courtiers and an explorer during the Elizabethan era, began pipe smoking and helped spark this fad. See, peer pressure. Pouches and purses that carried it became fashionable in Queen Elizabeth's court. Smoking quickly became an expensive English habit and Europeans became addicted. Next. The original workers of the North American colony were indentured white servants who were not held in perpetual servitude. They signed contracts with time limitations, promising work for passage to the new colonies from Europe. The vast majority of indentured servants were extremely poor, powerless. While their lives were not easy and were restrictive, they could, if they survived long enough, be rewarded with a new life. If they finished their contract, indentured servants were given land, animals, and other supplies to help them process to start their own lives in this colony after, the successful completion of their obligations. Demand for land grew due to the increased demand of tobacco in Europe. So did the cost of maintaining those indentured servants. Tobacco is a challenging crop to produce. It requires year-round attention. Additionally, growing tobacco took a toll on the land, on the soil, draining it of its nutrients. Because of the time that was necessary between planting and rotating, a huge demand for additional farmland was created. In 1621, the settlement sent a crop of 600,000 pounds of tobacco to Europe. 6 years later, shipments totaled 500,000 pounds. 2 years later, 3 times that much. By 1640, London was importing nearly 1.5 million pounds of tobacco annually from Virginia. Next slide. So what was happening in Africa during this time? I think Europe and Europeans were familiar with Africa and knew about its immense resources and wealth. I think we watch old Tarzan movies and old movies, and we seem to think that Africa or its people are backwards or primitive. And they definitely were not. They are known for being rich in resources. The African continent and its inhabitants were recognized for their technological advanced methods of agriculture and craftsmanship. African rulers and merchants had established trade routes within the Mediterranean world, Western Asia, and the Indian Ocean. So why were Africans chosen? It was simple. Africa had a ready-made workforce. Next slide. The transatlantic slave trade was responsible for the largest movement of people in history, not just the largest forcible placement of human beings. It's estimated that over 20 million people were taken from their homes and sold into slavery, many dying along the way. At least 15 to 30% of Africans captured died during the march to slaveholding areas, walking in chains for weeks, as shown in this picture to the left, even months to the slave coast shipping ports from their village, then living in cages awaiting purchase and transport. Doctors would inspect those enslaved men, women, and children before purchase to determine which individuals were most likely to survive the voyage. So this loss built America and drained Africa. African societies were disrupted by this loss and enslavement of millions of its people. Colonizers used the skilled labor of Africans to build the economic engine, which would ultimately become the most powerful and richest nation in the world. Next slide. I think there we go. Back to the colony. Africa, slavery supported an economy in which people from 4 continents derived benefits, including North America. Everyone who participated in the economy benefited from slavery. Bankers who owned money or developed slave securities to fund the expansion of plantations. Insurance companies insuring commodities. Slave ship captains and crews. Slave owners had free labor. African chieftains who benefited from receiving arms and money. Shop owners who made profits from the sale of goods, as well as accountants who even managed these records. Ordinary people who purchased tobacco products, rice, and clothing that came because of slave labor. Slavery, tobacco, and the resulting capital that was derived from it built the economic foundation of America. Next slide. So according to the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database, from approximately 1525 to 1866, over 12.5 million enslaved Africans were forcibly transported across the Atlantic Ocean into forcible lifetime enslavement. Only 10.7 million survived the trip. These people taken from Africa, they were not backwards. They were not lazy. They were not dumb. They were members of families, farmers, builders. They were important to the life of African society. Most slaves were transported to South America and the Caribbean first, while another 388,000 were brought directly to the United States. Now, there had to be something to justify brutality such as this. Next slide. At least half of European immigrants who came to Virginia between 1620 and 1680 arrived as indentured servants. So remember, we talked about this before. This was a contractual agreement. It was a fixed term. Groups of Africans and indentured servants often worked side by side and even commingled socially. The notion of enslavement changed throughout the 1600s. In this early period, enslavement was not an automatic condition, nor did it uniformly apply to all Africans and African descended people. Very importantly, being enslaved was not necessarily a permanent lifetime status. The boundaries between the groups were fluid, but that began to shift over the next few decades to make strict distinctions. What brought this on? There was an uprising of Virginia's white and African indentured servants, led by a landowner and colonist, Nathaniel Bacon. You may have heard of Bacon's Rebellion. He rebelled against the rule of Governor William Berkeley. This frightened landowners and ushered in the invention of legalized racism. After Bacon's Rebellion, seeing poor whites and Africans united in a cause alarmed the ruling class. Historians believe that this is the key factor that accelerated the hardening of racial lines associated with slavery, and as a way for planters and the colony to exercise that control over the poor. This shift here marked the beginning of the legalized concept of racial slavery. After this time, you see the formation of slave codes. In addition to slave codes, rich colonists did something else. They invented a new class of people and provided them with created privileges. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, the first appearance in print of the adjective white in reference to a white man, a person of race distinguished by a light complexion, was in 1671. Next slide. So we have the legalization of race. This proved to be a very useful tool. Race, racism, and the social concept of racial superiority, inferiority is a social construct that allows the few to profit from the labor of the many. Slavery not only enriched the wealthy, but it also served as a mechanism to diffuse class tensions between the wealthy and the poor. So why is this one thing so powerful? Research shows that social comparisons matter. People constantly evaluate themselves and others in domains like attractiveness, wealth, intelligence. I mean, according to some studies, there's as much as 10% of our thoughts involve comparisons of some kind. And if you don't believe me, look at Facebook, look at Instagram, look at TikTok and all those other forms of social media. They are literal petri dishes to support this thought. So racism, white superiority, and Black inferiority provided the perfect way for people to see themselves and their difficult life relative to someone else. This legalized racism meant that poor whites based their own social and personal worth based on who or what they thought they stack up against. Not wealthy landowners, but poor slaves and people who were assigned to a permanent underclass. Next slide. Also around the same time, when slavery and racism were being ingrained within society, tobacco became the most valuable export from the colonies. In Spain was the home of the first large-scale manufacturing company of tobacco products. They produce around 75% of the cigarettes consumed in Europe. And the city of Seville in Spain held a monopoly on tobacco commerce with the Americas. So slide 20. Does someone have a question? Okay. Okay, 1839. A slave known only as Stephen worked on a farm of Captain Abisha Slade. He developed a new means of curing tobacco with heat, producing a vivid yellow bright leaf tobacco. This new product gained popularity very quickly, and bright leaf or flue-cured tobacco was soon produced throughout the region. Farmers quickly discovered the new curing process made tobacco a viable crop on land that was formerly considered worthless. More farmers started to use this method to make more money. Next slide. 1850, notice the increase in slaves. From 1820 to 1860, the enslaved were not imported into the US, slaves were born. Cotton, rice, sugar, and tobacco created this vast economy. Next slide. Notice that within 20 years, the explosive growth of slaves. In 1860, there were more millionaires, all of them slaveholders, living in the lower Mississippi Valley than anywhere else in the United States. In the same year, nearly 4 million enslaved Americans were valued at $3.5 billion, with a B, billion dollars, making the enslaved the largest single financial asset of the entire US economy at the time. People were the largest asset. Slaves were worth more than all manufacturing and railroads combined. America's wealth was built on the backs of these enslaved Africans. In April 16th, 1862, President Abraham Lincoln signed a bill to ease the economic pain of slaveholders who were loyal to the Union. The District of Columbia Emancipation Act paid such slaveholders up to $300 for every enslaved person freed. The federal government paid slave owners for their freedom for 2,900 former slaves. To date, no funds have ever been paid to former slaves or their descendants. In 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation set the stage for freeing African Americans from over 244 years of bondage and forced servitude. After the Civil War ended in 1865, many African Americans became sharecroppers and became paid harvesters of tobacco crops. Next slide. Juneteenth commemorates June 19th, 1865, when all previously enslaved people were free. This was a full 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation was signed into law. So what happened after slavery ended? The Reconstruction Acts of 1867 began this period of time where newly freed African Americans enjoyed this period where they were able to vote, actively participate in the political process, acquire the land of former owners, seek their own employment, and even use public accommodations. Prior to the Civil War, slave states had laws forbidding literacy for the enslaved. But by emancipation, only a small percentage of African Americans knew how to read and write. Thus, there was such motivation in this period in the African American community to learn to read and write. Of the 105 historically Black colleges and universities, 29 were founded during this period from 1867 to 1877. In South Carolina, African Americans greatly outnumbered whites, so much so that African American representatives to the state house outnumbered white representation. Many legislators worked to rewrite the state constitution and pass laws ensuring aid to public education, universal male voting, and civil rights for all. By the 1890s, thousands of small business operations opened in urban areas. The most rapid growth came in the early part of the 20th century. The National Negro Business League, which Booker T. Washington promoted, opened over 600 chapters, and this reached every city with a significant African American population. So what happened? Next slide. 103 years of Jim Crow. Jim Crow laws asserted themselves in the South as Reconstruction was ending. The law supported segregation of parks, even cemeteries, theaters, restaurants, to prevent any contact between Blacks and whites as equals. It codified on local and state levels, and most famously with separate but equal decision in the United States Supreme Court. It was Plessy versus Ferguson. The Supreme Court codified racial segregation in 1896 in Plessy versus Ferguson. This is the first major inquiry into the meaning of the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. The clause prohibits states from denying equal protection of the laws to any person within their jurisdiction. The case stemmed from an 1892 incident in which Homer A. Plessy, who was 1/8 Black and 7/8 white, refused to sit in a car. The purposeful action was aimed at testing the constitutionality of Louisiana's Separate Car Act. The Supreme Court ruled that the law that implies merely a legal distinction between whites and Blacks was not unconstitutional. The Plessy versus Ferguson ruling gave permission for the restrictive Jim Crow legislation and separate public accommodations based on race. And this became commonplace. It wasn't until the landmark decision in Brown versus the Board of Education in Kansas in 1954 that the Supreme Court ruled unanimously that racial segregation in public schools did indeed violate the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. That landmark decision served as a major catalyst for the civil rights movement. Ironically, the original dissenter of Plessy versus Ferguson became the law of the land. So Jim Crow touched every aspect of everyday life. Segregation was enforced in public schools, phone booths, hospitals, jails, residential homes for the elderly and handicapped. Whites and Blacks were even prohibited from boating together because boating was implied to be social and social equity. In Birmingham, Alabama, it was illegal for Blacks and whites to play checkers or dominoes together. Many industries could not hire Black people, but one industry could and did. Do we even need to guess which one that was? Next slide. So with the rise of Jim Crow, African Americans experienced a new form of terror, driven by extreme poverty, a lack of trust of healthcare workers, lack of adequate education, stereotyping, prejudice, and even the stress caused by racism and bigotry. Black schools, therefore, received far less financial support than did white schools. Black schools had fewer books, overcrowding, worse buildings, less paid teachers, Segregated schools marked this also stigma of inferiority and a status of second class citizenship. And this was not even that far long ago. My mother was born in 1955. She is from rural Louisiana. And she tells me stories all the time of getting the secondhand books after the white school was done with them. When they were in home ec, they got the old sewing machines that the white school they got. Like my mother tells stories of, yeah, they closed our schools, and when we integrated, we started to go to school all together. I mean, my mom is only 67 years old. Next slide. So without healthcare, housing, educational opportunities, or the ability to find jobs, many African Americans left the Deep South following the Civil War and migrated north to seek better opportunities, reshaping the social and political geographic landscape. This migration brought opportunity, but change. Over a period of 60 years, from 1910 to 1970, over 6 million African Americans moved from the South to urban areas in the northern states. So this Great Migration happened in two parts. It coincides with the participation and the effects of both of the world wars. First Great Migration, 1910 to 1940, had Black Southerners relocate to northern and Midwestern cities like New York, Chicago, Detroit, Pittsburgh. When the war effort ramps up in 1917, more able-bodied men were sent off to Europe to fight, leaving those industrial jobs behind. The labor supply was, obviously strained with the decline of immigration from Europe and the standing bans on people of color from other parts of the world. All of this afforded the opportunity for the Black population to be the labor supply in non-agricultural industries. Although these migrants found better jobs and fled the South, that was already heavily, entrenched in Jim Crow, many African Americans faced injustices and difficulties after migrating. The Red Summer of 1919, I'm not sure if you ever studied this in history class. Red Summer, it's called Red because of lots of bloodshed, was a number of race riots and racial terrorism taking place in dozens of cities over the summer in 1919. So incidents like that, rooted in tensions and prejudice, arose from white people having to adjust to the demographic changes in their local communities. From World War I to World War II, it was estimated that about 2 million Black people left the South for other parts of the country. Black people who migrated during the second phase of the Great Migration were met with housing discrimination, as localities had started to implement restrictive covenants like redlining, which created segregated neighborhoods, which obviously has long-standing effects today, but also served not just the neighborhoods, but just a foundation for existing racial disparities in wealth within the United States. Next slide. So, smoking tobacco was harsh. In 1900, most people only smoked a few cigarettes, about 54 per person per year, aged 18 and older. We're way down at the beginning, around the graph before World War I. Next slide. Enter menthol. So around that time, Lloyd Spud Hughes, an Ohio man, was credited with introducing American smokers to menthol flavored cigarettes by accident. He stored his tobacco in a tin, and he also had mints in there. And he discovered that, after smoking his tobacco, the menthol made the smoking less harsh and giving it a feeling of a cool sensation. Spud cigarettes were introduced to the market in 1925 and quickly became popular. Because menthol cigarettes are less harsh, they often act as a starter product. More and more people began to smoke and smoke more often. Other cigarette companies launched their own brand of menthol. Brown and Williamson launched Cool in 1932. And by 1956, R.J. Reynolds introduced Salem, the first filter-tipped menthol cigarette. Newport was also launched in 1957. The Newport brand is currently owned and manufactured by R.J. Reynolds and is the best-selling brand of menthol in the world. Next slide. The tobacco industry was reliant on the work of Black men and women in significant numbers. In the 1930s, about half of all persons employed in manufacturing positions in the tobacco industry were African American. Almost all Black employees were unskilled and confined to the lowest paid jobs and just deplorable working conditions, while reserving skilled jobs for whites. This structure set up a system of race-based dual wages and reinforced divisions between Black and white workers, ensuring entrenched poverty in the city's Black communities. Racism provided for the fertile ground that laid the groundwork for civil rights unionism. So this marked the beginning of the emergence of labor-based civil rights movement. The process of organization also led to voter registration drives, membership, organizations like the NAACP just having those membership campaigns and true organization in Black communities. Tobacco companies were some of the first industries to hire African Americans in sales and eventually management. Companies began seeing African Americans not just as workers, but also a potential market. Philip Morris started advertising in African American publications in the 1940s. Next slide. And indeed, in the first decades of the 20th century, the only ads featuring African Americans were racist advertisement that used Black caricatures to advertise to white consumers, as you can see on the left. But as World War II came to a close, tobacco companies needed to expand to new markets in order to maintain prosperity. And as you can see, the change in the advertisement and marketing on the right. At this point, they started issuing mass marketing efforts targeting African Americans as the demographic, becoming urban-centric and earning more wages. Next slide has another example. The change from the left to the right. Next slide. And, their efforts seem to work. 89% of African American smokers smoke menthol. The cigarette consumption increased to an average of 4,000 per person in 1963. This is the time when Jim Crow laws ended. Next slide. So despite Jim Crow, doing business in the African American community was profitable to many corporations, including Big Tobacco. African American consumers were often relegated to the back of the bus, the rear entry of a store or restaurant. At the time when sponsorships from businesses outside of the African community were rare, positive images of African Americans in the media were even rarer. and little to no African-American voices were being heard in the advertising world. Tobacco and alcohol companies saw this as an opportunity to fill a void to increase their product sales. At the same time, tobacco companies found a different way to increase their market and open up their product sales to these markets. So here are the 3 most popular magazines that could be found in the majority of African-American homes in 1950. 1950 was Jet and Ebony, and I think the 70s was more for Essence. Next slide. So a 1-year study found that the 3 major African-American publications, Ebony, Jet, and Essence, received proportionally higher profits from cigarette advertisements than any other magazines. Between 1992 and 2002, Ebony had almost 10 times more likely to see a menthol ad in this magazine. And I truly always remember seeing Virginia Slim ads in Ebony. Next slide. So the tobacco industry attempts to maintain a positive image and public support among African Americans by supporting cultural events and making contributions to minority higher education institutions, elected officials, civic and community organizations, and even scholarship programs. Even today, they use elected officials against public health advocates trying to ban menthol. So next slide has some examples of some mentholated products. Next slide. Also products popular in the Black community, Black and Mild, these little cigars and cigarillos. Next slide. These are all flavored products as well. Swisher Sweets. Next slide. So in June of 2009, President Obama signed into law the Family Smoking Prevention and Tobacco Control Act, which gave the FDA the authority to regulate the manufacturing, marketing, and sale of tobacco products. This law authorized the FDA to eliminate all flavors except menthol and mint as a characterizing flavor. And we just thought that this was going to change a lot. Next slide. And this is where we are, now that we're still waiting on the FDA to issue long-awaited rules to finally include mint and menthol in those characterizing flavors. Next slide. So we would think that, we passed this law in 2009, we would see a dip in tobacco consumption, we would see, better health outcomes for African Americans, but we look at the tobacco advertisements during that time. It's 2.6 times more tobacco advertisement per person in areas with African American majority compared to white majority areas. A greater number of tobacco retailers means community members face more exposure to tobacco marketing. Retail marketing made up 95% of the tobacco industry's $8 billion marketing expenditure in 2015. So there's an estimated 375,000 tobacco retailers in the United States. That's 27 times more than McDonald's, 28 times more than Starbucks. And I was shocked to know that because I see a Starbucks on every corner. So, and they're also disproportionately located in low income communities.
There's a surprise.
Right. So low income African American communities have been bombarded with cigarette advertising. Next slide. So we think that we're winning and that cigarette consumption would go down, lives would be saved. This law that was put into that was signed, would change things. And it did, but not with menthol. As a matter of fact, menthol preference skyrocketed. Marketing research showed African Americans, had that preference for menthol. African Americans usually smoke fewer cigarettes, but start at an older age than white Americans. They're more likely to die from smoking related diseases as well. A large part of the reason is menthol cigarettes. It is a chemical that has this cooling effect. It's easier to start, harder to quit. And this is why we see many states and localities working to ban menthol. So it is my hope that this talk provided with some context on how Africans were brought to America. We're going to watch a quick documentary, it's just 15 minutes. It's called Black Lives, Black Lungs. And then we'll take a quick 2-minute break. And then Heather Medicine Bear will do her portion of the presentation. And I'm so sorry, I forgot that last slide that went with what I said. It's all good.
Years ago, I accepted an internship with Truth Initiative. At the time, I thought I knew everything I needed to know about tobacco. Yes, it could be deadly, but my generation was rejecting it in much larger numbers. But what I knew was just the beginning. Today, tobacco-related diseases are still the #1 cause of death in the African American community, and that's not a coincidence. During my time with Truth Initiative, I read dozens of research articles and stacks of internal documents directly from tobacco industry files. I learned that the tobacco industry strategically and successfully infiltrated my community. And while it's true that they targeted many groups, the targeting of the Black community has been uniquely damaging.
Critics charge that the tobacco companies view Black smokers as a growing source of income. In fact, they say, Blacks are the target of carefully plotted and highly specific marketing campaigns.
For decades, the tobacco companies have used predatory practices aimed to push their deadly product onto the Black community. Practices that contribute to the approximately 45,000 Black people who will die every year from tobacco-related diseases. The film, Black Lives, Black Lungs, is part of my effort to turn my anger into action. I've set out to give voice to some of the experts and activists who spent their lives taking on the tobacco industry, because understanding the history of this 50-year plus campaign is critical for taking back the health of our community.
In high school, I became involved in tobacco control because my uncle passed away from tobacco-related diseases. And I remember him telling me when I was younger that when he first started, it was because the industry told him it would cure his asthma. And if you were to hear that statement today, you would think that's the most ludicrous thing you've ever heard. And I just felt like it was so unfair for an industry to be able to target someone like my uncle and have him die as a result. If he had known the real health effects from the get-go, he would have never picked it up. I lost my uncle to an industry who does not care about him, who does not care about the Black body. And I feel I have a responsibility to speak out against it.
Addiction is about brain chemistry and it's about access. It's not about personal weakness. It's not about poor Black people just are going to do something anyway. It's about that you give this entity access to the brains of your children, of your people, and they become addicted.
There's nothing inherently Black about menthol cigarettes. They were invented in 1925 by Lloyd Spud Hughes. Spud created his own brand, Spud brand, which were the first widely sold menthol cigarettes in the United States. In 1932, Brown & Williamson Tobacco launched its own menthol brand, Pull. And in 1956, industry behemoth R.J. Reynolds introduced Salem, the first menthol cigarette with a filter tip. R.J. Reynolds marketed Salem as fresher, cool, and refreshing. Of course, all without any scientific proof.
Salem special paper breathes in fresh air with every puff.
the death rates for African Americans who smoke hover around 49,000 per year. It's no accident that African Americans smoke more menthol cigarettes.
One of the greatest marketing coups that took place in the 20th century is transforming menthol cigarette into a black cigarette. The African Americanization of menthol cigarettes in the United States starts with finding a specialty product for African Americans following World War II. Many African Americans had moved to the North. There were specialty products being developed for them, certain hair creams, certain foodstuffs, and the tobacco industry, particularly some of them, began to realize we could market a particular brand to this group of people. Brown and Williamson conducted a number of focus groups in the late 50s and early 60s that identified that African Americans were more receptive to TV commercials, more receptive to the messages that are provided there. Brown and Williamson then took 90% of their budget and put it into television advertising because they knew African Americans would disproportionately look at that. They began to use black images on television and in their ads. In 1953, 5% of African Americans used menthol products compared to 3% for whites. By 1968, that had tripled to 14%. By 1976, it had tripled again to over 42%. Into the 2000s, we're above 80%. That's the African Americanization of menthol cigarettes in the United States. It's the targeted marketing over a half a century toward black folks.
Let's dig in a little bit deeper and talk about how African Americans are disproportionately burdened by death and disease from tobacco, cigars, and cigarillos. When it comes to understanding it as a public health issue, I didn't know about that, or a social justice issue in particular, until I started working with TRDRP and Truth Initiative. I didn't understand that the industry had been targeting my community.
Jim Crow, there's a civil rights battle going on, and the tobacco industry is way past that. They've got Elston Howard, catcher for the New York Yankees, black man selling cool cigarettes. They have executives in their offices in North Carolina that they're, promoting while black folks can't even get a job or sit at a lunch counter. So they're way ahead of the curve.
In 1971, the Public Health Cigarette Smoking Act banned the advertising of cigarettes on TV and radio.
The tobacco industry was one of the first industries to recognize not all marketing needs to go toward white males. So it was good to see black people in the ads and to see that there were black models and that it wasn't all drugs and gangs. And so it was hard, people saw that and they were very much attracted to that.
For decades, the tobacco industry has infiltrated the Black community, infiltrated Black institutions. In return, what the Black community got was death and disease.
We know the facts. We have the scientific knowledge that tells us that we die in larger numbers. If people stopped smoking, if people resisted using these products, it's a preventable disease. We wouldn't have to die in such large numbers. Why do some things still happen in society that we know are wrong? It's all tied to money. Why is the tobacco industry able to sell a product that will definitely, undoubtedly kill you? Because there's money tied to it. And money makes things happen.
I found myself very touched and even upset over what I was seeing because I saw lists of organizations that included organizations that I grew up in, organizations that I was currently a member of, and I had no idea that behind the scenes there were negotiations between the leaders of these organizations and tobacco companies where they were accepting money and sponsorships.
So in the summer of 1984, I was in my preventive medicine residency at Johns Hopkins. I was doing internships around the country. And so one of the organizations I did an internship was with the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation. While I was there, I was very concerned about the relationship between the CBCF and the tobacco industry. So I started talking to other interns who were there, and then also my supervisors to sort of see, what can be done. Is it possible to do something from the inside? Because I knew that the effect that it was having on African Americans in general. And so what they suggested was that I write a memo to the executive director. So the memorandum reads, I am very much disturbed by the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation's policy of promoting cigarette smoking. I am especially disturbed at the free distribution of cigarettes at CBCF functions. I am requesting that you raise these issues at the CBCF Policy Board in the hope that we will adopt a policy more in line with our interest in the well-being of Black Americans. And that's how it begins.
Unfortunately, somewhere in the neighborhood of 90% of all African American civil, religious, political, social organizations take money from the tobacco industry. That's just because we ain't got no money. They're buying, they're buying the silence of these people. The Congressional Black Caucus is a multi-million-dollar foundation. And last time I looked, at least half of their members take money from the tobacco industry. Now, not all of them do. And we try to work, of course, with the ones that don't, like Karen Bass from Los Angeles and Barbara Lee from up here, Alma Adams in North Carolina. But it's a hard sell and still a hard push to get groups to speak up against the tobacco industry.
The tobacco industry has a very interesting and highly complex relationship with African Americans. Yes, the tobacco industry was the first, or among the first industries to give African Americans high-level executive jobs. They fund several Black scholarships, including the Thurgood Marshall Fund. They funded a major civil rights organization, including the NAACP, the National Urban League, the Congress of Racial Equality, and much more. They did give people in the entertainment industry their first leg up. But you can give me everything in the world, but at the end of the day, what is this industry doing? 47,000 African Americans a year die as a result of tobacco-related diseases. That is the leading cause of death in the African American community. There's not enough shiny trinkets in the world that you can give me in exchange for my life. There's not enough shiny trinkets in the world that you can give me in exchange for my brother's life, for my sister's life. It doesn't matter how much money you pump into the community. We are worth so much more. In my experience, people have been shocked to learn that, they fund so much, that their dollars reach so far. But I think that needs to be known.
Sitting at my desk one day in 1998, when the Surgeon General's report comes out, first report on racial and ethnic minorities in smoking, and it just kind of slapped me in the face that African Americans were dying disproportionately of tobacco-related diseases across the board.
I was actually one of the first to start looking at what the industry had written in their own words about their plans to market their products to African American communities, and looking at their relationship building with African American organizations and organizations that I was currently a member of, and I had no idea that behind the scenes there were negotiations between the leaders of these organizations and tobacco companies. They were accepting money and sponsorships. Tobacco-related diseases was really, I saw a main cause for the health disparities that were affecting my community. I couldn't turn my back on this. I just couldn't. One of my colleagues actually saw me crying at my desk at UC San Francisco because I was just so upset over what I was seeing. And she asked a question, I wonder if others in your community would have this kind of reaction to these documents. We then got funding to do another project when we took the documents to groups of African American smokers and young people, elderly people in the community, to find out if they would have a similar reaction. And it was very clear that this was information that they didn't have, that they wanted it, that they wished that they had had prior to them picking up a cigarette.
I work with a group, the African American Tobacco Control Leadership Council. Our tagline is Saving Black Lives, and that at bottom, it is a social justice question. You might look at it this way: when you have the tobacco industry targeting of African Americans, disproportionately advertising in our communities, giving away free samples, menthol products are less expensive in the African American community. It's a classic definition of a social justice issue where there is a major player taking advantage of a lesser person. Now, there has been some changes. The National NAACP passed a resolution at their July convention saying that chapters could support local and state resolutions to curb or regulate menthol. This is a major breakthrough.
Yeah, the legislation I'm signing today represents change that's been decades in the making. Today, thanks to the work of Democrats and Republicans, healthcare and consumer advocates, the decades-long effort to protect our children from the harmful effects of tobacco has emerged victorious. Today, change has come.
It's always been an uphill battle. Look at the black folks who set up the Underground Railroad. Look at the black folks who fought Jim Crow. If we're going to fight this, then you're in it for the long haul.
Our communities are under great stress, so we need healthier lifestyles, but we don't need people dumping this poison in our neighborhoods.
If you know someone who smokes, who's black, they probably smoke menthol cigarettes. Tell their story.
I think when it comes to just living as an African American, understanding that just because of who we are, our lives are constantly at threat, whether it is racial injustice, police brutality, being denied access to things. All of these issues are layered and connected.
I made a decision at 18 that I was going to fight back, and I am 67. I continue that fight.
Black Lives Matter, hands up, don't shoot. I can't breathe. I think we're all answering the same question. What is the worth of a Black body in the United States of America?
Thank you all for watching that. It is truly worth the watch. We'll just take a